right. Well, thank you for the invitation, Beat, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to also be mobile today. It's a completely new feeling. Freedom to operate, which is important, has something to do also with mitigating risk, right? So the slides I can probably advance from here. And okay. Oh, interesting. Pointer is separate. Okay. Yeah, I looked for the pointer, but that's the pointer. All right, so many of you know at the agency there are some special considerations, and of course I have to make a disclaimer that what I tell you today are my personal opinions. Of course, it's somewhat based on working on the experience and working with the agency. And one of the things that some of you recall, I actually made a very pragmatic choice to go to the agency after I spent some time in medical practice as a physician and worked in academia and the NIH and certainly in small business and biopharmaceutical industry. But we do have some opportunities, I think, to work closer with the agency, particularly when you think of the opportunity to develop better products faster. And that's to Werner's point, with all the risk assessments that we do, we often, particularly at the agency, miss out on missed opportunity, which is certainly also an important consideration when we think about life. So from a point of the agency, we have a very broad mission, namely to protect and promote public health. And as such, we deal with a number of products. And when you think of a function in a society, we also have responsibility in speeding up innovation and bringing products to the market that are that are not available, and making it possible to develop new products, particularly for patient groups that don't have very little or no treatments available, and when the treatments are very insufficient. And when you think of building preparedness of our society for some of the possibilities that even very highly civilized cultures can be threatened by, for example, microbial challenges or fast-spreading infections through our globalization, then you understand that the agency does play a critical role in it. And many of you know that we also regulate tobacco products. So it's important to understand, however, also for this purpose of this discussion, that we do not regulate veterinary practice or medical practice for that matter. And then there are a few things that we consume that you would think should be regulated under FDA, or at least in consideration with FDA's approaches, and they are not. And of course, restaurant practice or not, border is not. Advertising in general is not, but when it relates to medical product, it is. And we all know how, since we also deal with patients and patient-reported outcomes and patient feedback, and I will come to that a little bit more specific, it's quite important to pay attention to the advertising that is done. So why do we have regulatory agencies? And the reason I bring this up, because the new administration in the US has a slightly different approach to it. At least there were some considerations for cutting out some of the steps, thinking that if you have less regulation, you have faster products on the market and thereby you're rid of the problem, but that's not quite the case. And I think we probably all agree as we are here. The agency was actually formed on the basis of catastrophes throughout history. And some of you remember, particularly since we're in Europe, the thalidomide Contagan situation, where we were fortunate in the US that one of the safety considerations prevented the drug from entering the market. But there are daily challenges with it. Just a few years, contaminations, heparin purity, and the manufacturing processes pose significant health threats, and also in terms of the product quality, because some of the criteria, of course, is very critically linked to the quality of product when we think of safety and effectiveness. So why do we need to make change? Why do we need to think of changes? Well, there's a lot of impetus from starting from the increasing costs and the disillusion about the large pharma taking care of all of the problems. Then there are adverse reactions that we hadn't really anticipated in spite of a rather rigorous process in the approval to the market and licensure. And the advertising, of course, I mentioned. In some cases, it almost borders to misrepresentation, and we have to be very mindful of this. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be open-minded and take some risk, but we have to be mindful. So the healthcare costs are one of the critical drivers, and it's one of my points also for today's presentation, that we have to do something about it. We also have a challenge through the globalization process, and here's just to think of food that we import in the US, specifically seafood. Almost most of the seafood comes from somewhere else, and if you don't understand the origins, if you do not have good relationships with the manufacturers, we take unreasonable risks. Medical devices, half of it at least is produced overseas. And when we come to drugs, just look at this. 80% of the raw material and the API that we use, even for products that are made in the US, which is about half now, comes from the outside. So this is all a global ecosystem that we have to take in consideration. The challenge for the agency is that there are legal restrictions and legal opportunities as such. Many of the things we do on an iterative process. So we create a case law. And of course, we need to make decisions in the context of either an established policy, or we have to generate a new policy, but it cannot be disconnected to what we just said the year before. So science here plays a critical role, and I think we all agree because we are at a scientific conference, but this is also something we need to communicate broader in our society, including investors, and investors in a broader sense. So when we talk to our partners and the stakeholders, the values play an important role, and judgment is influenced critically by value, and often includes some consideration for the bigger picture and what impact does it have on other decisions in our society if we change one or the other. So as long as the values are similar amongst all of us, I think we can find some agreement, even though our culture doesn't necessarily always demonstrate it. But I think we also have wide differences occasionally, and profit certainly drives a lot of good things, but we have to make sure that the drive or the engine of profit is anchored well in our value system. So the more we have uncertainty, the greater is the play of judgment and values, and how do we deal with this? So we cannot make ad hoc decisions. We have to be consistent. Decisions must be fair, not arbitrary. And one of the historic triumphs of FDA is that we have a controlled, transparent process which leverages evidence and evidence-based medicine. Just a little bit about the history here. There are some critical legal considerations. 38, very importantly, Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and some amendments later on. And 62 is a very important milestone as well, namely to prove effectiveness. And some politicians have forgotten this. So this is a summary of the statutory and legal authorities. And of course, we also work a lot with guidance documents. Those are often in development in dialogue, and I think it's very critical to consider and know the opportunity to do this in dialogue. So for medical devices, it's a little bit more complex. And just to put your attention to 1976, this is essentially where the 510K regs were established, namely to grandfather in anything that was prior on the market. If you make something equivalent to it, then you can gain approval through this particular pathway. It's getting more and more complicated, because new technologies and new products still want to make that reference because it's a very effective way to get to the market, and yet in some cases it's not sufficient anymore. So let's remember that those are the standards of obtaining a licensure: safety, purity, potency, stability, and also the process, GMP compliance, very importantly. And those are the criteria that actually drove us into a medical product life cycle process that is illustrated here in a very linear way. And of course, we all know about the complications that happen here. Phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 in a relatively strict manner separated. And yet, if you think of the data that's generated during the time, that should actually all contribute towards marketing approval. And there are several ways where the agency interacts with its stakeholders and where some kind of information has to be submitted. And certainly we have also post-market activity and supervision, if you want to call it that way, that is very critical for the effective use and the safety and the quality of the manufacturing of the product, and not last, the availability of the product, because that's also a significant challenge to have the product available. Now, such a linear, rigid process doesn't necessarily reflect what we should be doing in the future, particularly when you think of some of the opportunities of fast track, accelerated approval, expedited review, parallel track, and treatment INDs, pathways that give alternative options that are not as time-consuming and in some ways more specific for the particular patient subgroup that we are dealing with. But in a way, it's a very integrated and also reverse engineering process where different steps feed back information into the prior step as we look at it in a more, let's say, circular or global way. Now, of course, risk-benefit considerations are very critical. And most of our things where we have uncertainty, we need to make good decision, and decision-making science plays a critical role. So drug-drug interactions, as you can imagine, with patients who take, let's say, 15 to 20 drugs is a critical thing. And if we do not leverage the feedback from patients, then we don't learn much. And as such, I think to understand also that patients in this relatively linear process, or I want to call it a circular re-engineering process, play a critical role. And as such, the agency has set out to engage patients in a very defined and scientific way and make them co-investigators. Patient-reported outcome, patient preferences, those are very important elements that are now included in the somewhat historic, let me call it paternal way of practicing medicine. But the outcome is significantly better. And when I tell you something about outcome and impact and better performance, it somehow gets me to the theme of eventually perhaps stimulating you to think about how to de-risk the product development process in a collaborative, transparent way across the aisles and across the stakeholders. Of course, there are different interests when you think of a for-profit organization and a regulator, or a for-profit organization and a patient. But I think as a society, particularly if we can demonstrate that we are not a primitive society, we have the opportunity to interact in meaningful ways. And I think this is something that I would like you to encourage to engage into. There's also a strict economic drive to this. I think the slide is a little bit old here. The latest considerations for a typical pharmaceutical product to get from lead molecules or the basic idea to a product takes not just a relatively long time, but also costs whoever pays for it, our society, significant resources, and it's actually higher now. It's over 2 billion, and some of this was published, I guess, a couple of years ago. So you can debate if this is true for each and every product, but on average, I think that's a lot of money that goes into a single product. Now, we still deal with drug failures in phase 3 trials, and that's an opportunity where we can do something about the costs. And I think that's an opportunity to think about how to mitigate risk. Typically, in trial failures, and I believe if it's not listed here, it's about half of it, maybe 40% at this time, and Katrin Theiner is here in the audience. She probably has some latest number in the area of nano technology containing pharmaceutical products, as we would call them. The efficacy definitions, safety deficiencies, and safety and efficacy deficiencies are still the leading factors. And now looking into some of the more specific questions here, and I want to make a point with this, not just to inform you about it. Dose selection, study endpoint definitions, inconsistent results. So how are the data collected? What kind of endpoint is defined? And inconsistent results across different trial sites are among the leading causes for clinical trials to fail. And you all can imagine how much money that costs when trials fail and product eventually do not get to the market. So this can be all addressed scientifically through scientific approaches and scientific dialogue. And I think this is one of the major directions that I want to lead you here with this, in addition to sharing this information. So there are just some detailing here and stratification into different disease areas, particularly when we talk about adverse events. I don't need to get into this much more because the numbers are easily understood. And of course, cardiovascular products are apparently most risky. And if you go into neuropsychiatric products, we all understand and can imagine how complicated it is in a very complex central nervous system. So there's a lot of opportunity for improvement. Now, safety reasons, theoretical risks, potential risks, inadequate data endpoints, renal hepatic impairment, and of course cardiac arrhythmic or QT elongations, as we call it, prolongations, are some of the issues that we have to deal with. Again, my point is, those are things one can address scientifically, particularly when we bring critical stakeholders together. So I think I made a point why we should engage into regulatory science. And here again, it is to say that major investments haven't paid out. It's too costly. When we deal with new technologies and new manufacturing science, we often struggle. Why? Because sometimes the agency is surprised. Agency has, of course, also scientists, and if they are not educated about this, then we are stuck, and it takes much longer. So when we think of standards and development tools, assays and parameters for characterization, physicochemical characterizations, there's a lot of work to do. And yet it cannot be done just by the agency, because it's probably not a well-hidden secret that Congress doesn't think the agency is a science and research agency, and as such prefers that we rubber stamp their approvals. Yet, if we don't understand the product, how can we make sure that it is safe? How can we meet our mission as an agency? And some of it was published, and certainly you can find the resources as here in the somewhat older National Bioeconomy Blueprint. But it also highlights the opportunity to engage into partnership, meaningful partnerships. So I talked about regulatory science a lot. Now actually agency occasionally gets questions about why we need to regulate science. That's not what it actually means. It's describing a subset of science that can contain basic science, but is often focused on developing tools, standards, and approaches to assess the safety, efficacy, and performance of the products. And as such, it's also often that what we know traditionally as translational science. So I think all of you are familiar with what regulatory science actually entails, even though the word may be a creation of the past decade. So what is critical to understand, we need to deal with science and we need to deal with evidence in order to make reasonable and meaningful decisions for the safety of the patients. Ineffective products are also a safety risk. And I think that's what some people forget on occasion. We do have some strategic plan for that. It's clear that we need to use the newest technology in order to address that. We promote innovation as an agency, and certainly we need to build the scientific capacity and infrastructure of the agency, but also change the culture and the way we collaborate through scientific development, professional development, and the opportunities that we have in our society as much as the law allows us. We cannot directly interact with highly regulated industry. As such, we need to find a neutral convener platform. This is not new to you. Those are the priority areas that we deal with at the agency. And keeping the time in mind where we perhaps want to keep some discussion for the end, I'm not going to spend much time on this. So, yet what's new? Electronic platforms, of course. That's what we live in our daily life. In the past 10 years, so much has changed, how we leverage tools and variables. And that's a great opportunity also for product development. As such, the idea to have an electronic device to facilitate and make everything easier is very appealing. And yet, what has changed really since we invented electronic health records? It used to be all paper, and then we used to search for things, and it was big compilations of folders and folders of paper that the agency received. They were shipped truckload-wise to the agency. And yet now with electronic information in the hospital, hasn't changed much. Why? Because we have a very segregated system. That's a big challenge to us, and we haven't really leveraged the opportunity to do this. And it's not a question of technology. It's a question of culture. So, what can we do about it? Well, one of the approaches we have taken, and I told you about the agency's openness to collaborative interactions and scientific co-solution of problems, we engaged into a collaborative project with the OneSource group, or also coincidentally called iSpy and iSpy 2. And I made some changes to the slides to put the references in, because these slides are actually given to me by the group of Laura Esserman at the University of California in San Francisco, who have been thinking about this for more than a decade, how to streamline the whole process, to really develop a patient benefit in this whole system, so that physicians have easier access to data and can make decisions in the healthcare system, that data is accessible, which ultimately leads to the benefit of a patient. And yet we haven't really leveraged this. And again, it's not the technology, it's the culture. So this is just the illustration of an ideal, easy, streamlined process here, where you also can leverage the data as we develop it in an iterative way. And it's also a very important consideration when we think of the design of our clinical trials, where we often struggle with enrollment. We don't have access to data. We have patient registries that we now leverage. And yet they are still in very separate systems. You can't see them. You have to have a specific relationship with either with a patient organization like, say, Patients Like Me as one of the examples, or others who accumulate significant patient databases and registries, and then we decide in which trial we can leverage them. So that's all pretty cumbersome still, and maybe we can do better. So that's yet another illustration, just to show you with some of the data standards how data gets converted and what critical role the coordinator plays in between. And at the end, all we want is the data stream to come to the FDA so we can actually understand and read the data, and that everyone in between has transparency to it. And we can have confidence in our decision-making process. So many steps, many times data transfers, many times uncertainties whether this was done right, many hours of still manual labor and double-checking. That is too cumbersome. No one can afford that. And in the process, the iSpy and OneSource project that we are interacting with, cut some of it out in a stage-wise process. Without going here into too much detail, I just want to bring the main point home that we can streamline the process. And there are some very important projects that are developed collaboratively with FDA who do that. Ideally, it would look kind of simple, as you remember the prior pictures, and that is something we hope we will have rather sooner than later, perhaps in the next 3 to, well, maybe 5 years, because things usually take a little longer, but just to give you an orientation. So I think regulatory science has the opportunity to provide access to data and thereby save significant resources, and also create an environment where you can work collaboratively. And that's actually this point. I think all the stakeholders listed around the circle here play a role in that, and that also requires a rethinking, a change of culture, and making sure that we do not remain in this mindset of segregation and making profit on things that are actually redundant. So, of course, it requires not just technology and a better process. It also and mainly requires the discipline to do so, the mindset to do so, the culture, and most importantly, the people. And that's why I'm here to talk with you about this, because you can make a change wherever you are, to think about it and drive it into the right direction, and also reach out to regulatory agencies and other stakeholders to engage and drive this idea further. So, for example, in new study design, it's obvious if you apply better statistics, you have a better outcome. And in general, human experience would agree that if you have a mitigator and an advocate in your process where two parties have somewhat different interests, let's say industry and the regulatory agency, it is often beneficial to do this collaboratively. So I don't think we have to debate the principle. What we haven't done is to actually demonstrate to particular groups in our society that that really works. So Bayesian statistics is very important, as you know, for those who think about changing trial design and making it better. Basket trials where different disease groups can be brought together and the commonalities can be leveraged in a decision-making process, and the data can be leveraged for the evidence generation of very important and critical examples thereof. So, in a way, it's pointing back to something that has been stated by the previous administration, also in the bioeconomic blueprint, and the opportunity to engage into public-private partnerships, because I truly believe it's required that all components of our society are engaged into this. And those are some examples for existing public-private partnerships. One of the challenges, though, is that we often have an issue. This is some activity at the agency in the context of the Critical Path Initiative, and just for you who historically are interested, these activities were started mainly under a Critical Path Initiative about at the turn of the millennium. And then the Critical Path Initiative was very much focused on the medical product centers, devices, biologics, and drugs. And regulatory science opened it up to the other product areas that FDA takes responsibility for. As such, it needed a new name. So regulatory science, engagement in many different variations. Some of the elements that we entertain from our office are certainly intramural research grants to stimulate the culture within the agency, because imagine reviewers or scientists who observe things as they go through the reviews in their particular disease area. What opportunity do we give them to articulate particular problems, formulate them into a project, and then engage into the project through collaborations, because they are still reviewers and they have to do their day job, and yet the problem that they have discovered needs collaborators who can work on that problem under the guidance of this observation from FDA reviewers. And I think to enhance the culture within the agency and the collaborative nature of interacting between the different centers, as well as the different expertise areas, is very critical. So for that, we have internal resources like core infrastructure of even equipment. Imagine the agency has 20,000 employees. Often they're segregated. They don't even know that we have duplication of equipment when they want to use something. That's something we need to do, and those are the small steps to do that. Also scientific working groups across the agency who are not limited by their particular report structure are very critical. But one important point I want to make is the Centers of Excellence in Regulatory Science, and I'll explain a little bit what that is when I come to the next slides. So again, this is an overview of our office's activity, and I know it's a small print, so it's just, again, reiterating what the previous slide stated, but to show it to you somewhat in context of the different activities, intramol programs, extramol programs, science resources coordination, and technology transfer are somewhere within the same framework because they intersect and stimulate each other. Most importantly, however, collaboration. So CERSIs are centers that are collaborative with academicians because we can leverage academic institutions not only with their expertise and talent as well as their infrastructure, but also because they can engage and they have experience in education. So we leverage the educational platform for the training of FDA scientists and professional development. We are forced to use some HHS grant mechanism, which is not ideal because, in essence, the academic institutions who offer their expertise often do not immediately engage into a project. Why? We don't have the resources. We are not a research agency. Most of the time, once the idea is formulated, we have to reach out and find the resources somewhere else, and that's one of the biggest complications. And that's also bringing me on to my major points that I want to make, namely that we need to rethink how we put resources into science and research. So this I've touched upon. It is about enhancement of science, particularly cutting-edge science where the agency doesn't have the resources, scientific exchange and collaboration, but it's also a platform for communication and dialogue. 2 minutes. Okay. So the opportunity is complex. Those are some examples of things that we get engaged in to give you a flavor. Patient preference studies, I mentioned it in context. Natural language processing, physicians' notes, for example, are not captured electronically. We need to find a way to deal with it. And we only can do this collaboratively. Here, one of our CERSIs who has the expertise. Many challenges with medical devices, as you can imagine, cybersecurity, intersect of technology with physiological systems are quite challenging. Those are examples of projects, the eSource and iSpy I mentioned with the UCSF team. There's some more. One of the critical points here is the following. If we do not figure out how we develop a culture and platform where research institutions can work collaboratively with FDA scientists to address the issues that we are dealing with, that address sponsor and industry, developer, but also public-private partnerships, patient organizations, and insurers questions, we will lose out. We cannot have the resources within the agency. The agency cannot pay academicians to conduct the research. Academicians are dependent on funding, in large by, of course, the NIH and foundations. But I think we need to create a new pathway where a transparent governance process on the platform of academia, perhaps in the case of the CERSIs, but there are other opportunities to do that, illustrate the confidence and the quality of the interaction to de-risk investments that are made in the health sector. And the conservative approach that our agency takes in the current process of transition prevented me from making some additional slides that would have illustrated how scientifically we actually tried to approach the process, but I can tell you that we engaged with some of the investment engineers who of course understand that de-risking through collaborative research is an opportunity where many problems can be resolved. So it's common sense, and yet we have not illustrated or demonstrated how much money is saved and how much is the return of investment improved. So this is a bit complicated, but of course we can, on the basis of some examples and some of the things that I told you today here, perhaps build models with the data and then simulate in several scenarios and communicate to not just the industry, who has learned about 20 years ago that translational science and translational science investment is critical for any of the pharmaceutical companies. You have departments for translational science or equivalency thereof. Now they have to understand that they need to invest into regulatory science, particularly leveraging the opportunity to work on a scientific basis collaboratively with FDA scientists and thereby de-risking their investment in a specific but also a broader sense. Not everything in this principle here is worked out, and I also leveraged the website that is from PricewaterhouseCoopers, one of the organizations that advises, of course, industry and keeps an eye on their processes. And I think I would invite you all to engage into this dialogue, either directly with me or my colleagues at the FDA, but also the academic institutions, other public organizations, and other concepts that have been developed globally in other areas of the world, so that we can find a meaningful platform to get this done. So, we need to change the culture. We are required to engage, otherwise we cannot address our mission. And hopefully all of us have patients in mind as a center. And with that, I thank you very much. So I think we have some time for questions, hopefully.
Thank you.